The sun painted the Wyoming sky crimson as Olivia Langford stood in the dusty yard, her trunk packed and loaded on the stagecoach, her tears cutting clean streaks through the dust on her cheeks. Daniel Redfield gripped the weathered porch post so tightly his knuckles turned white, his pride keeping him from saying the words that might make her stay. Jackson, Wyoming Territory, 1876. The town had grown considerably since the first settlers arrived, but it retained the raw, untamed feeling of the frontier. Daniel and Olivia's ranch sat 3 miles outside of town, nestled against the foothills with a view of the Tetons that still took Daniel's breath away, even after 5 years. "I can't do this anymore, Daniel," Olivia said, her voice barely audible above the spring wind that whipped her dark hair around her face. "I came out here to build something with you, not to live with a ghost who rides out at dawn and returns after dark." Daniel remained silent, his blue eyes fixed on the distant mountains. The truth of her words stung worse than any physical blow he'd ever endured. Since losing the South pasture grazing rights to the Harrington outfit, he'd worked himself to exhaustion trying to save their ranch, their dream. Somewhere along that path, he'd stopped seeing the pain in his wife's eyes. "The stage leaves in 20 minutes, she continued. "I'm going to my sister's in Colorado Springs. I need to remember who I am." Still, Daniel said nothing. The words were there that he loved her, that he'd change, that they could fix what was broken between them, but his throat felt like he'd swallowed sand. 5 years of marriage, and he couldn't find the courage to fight for it when it mattered most. "Goodbye, Daniel." She turned, her green calico dress swirling around her ankles as she walked toward the waiting stagecoach where the driver was securing her trunk. Only when she climbed into the coach did panic finally break through Daniel's stubborn pride. He took 3 steps forward, but the stagecoach was already moving, dust billowing behind it as it carried his wife away from him, from their home, from their life together. He stood in the yard until the stagecoach disappeared over the ridge, until the dust settled back to earth, until the only sound was the wind through the cottonwoods and the distant lowing of cattle. Then he turned and put his fist through the wall of their home. Evening fell with the kind of spectacular beauty that had first drawn them to this wild country. Daniel sat on the porch steps, a half-empty bottle of whiskey beside him, staring at the empty road. The silence of the house behind him was oppressive. He'd never noticed before how Olivia filled their home with life, with humming as she worked, with the scrape of her chair as she sat to mend his shirts, with her soft breathing beside him at night. Martha, their border collie, whined and nudged his hand. Daniel absently stroked her head, his thoughts racing. Every moment since Olivia had left, her accusations echoed in his mind. He'd been so focused on saving their ranch that he'd forgotten to save their marriage. "I've been a damn fool, Martha," he muttered to the dog. The animal tilted her head, her intelligent eyes fixed on his face. Inside the house, Daniel moved like a man in a dream. He found himself in their bedroom, standing before the dresser where Olivia kept her things. She'd left half her clothes, a sign that perhaps she hadn't meant to leave forever. His hand brushed against something hard in the drawer. He pulled it out, a small frame containing a pencil sketch he'd made of her during their first year of marriage. She'd been sitting by the creek, wildflowers in her hair, laughing at something he'd said. He'd captured that moment of pure joy, and she'd kept it all these years. Something broke inside Daniel then. The walls he'd built to protect himself from the fear of failure came crashing down. He sank to his knees, clutching the drawing to his chest, and for the first time since his father died, he wept openly. When the tears finally subsided, clarity came. He couldn't let her go without a fight. Their love was worth more than his pride, more than the ranch, more than anything. Daniel surged to his feet. The stagecoach had a 4-hour head start, but it would stop overnight in Riverton before continuing to Colorado. If he rode hard, cutting across the mountain pass instead of following the main road, he might reach Riverton before the stagecoach departed in the morning. Within 15 minutes, Daniel had saddled Thunder, his most dependable gelding, packed essential supplies, and secured his rifle in its scabbard. Martha looked up expectantly. "Stay, girl. Watch the place," he commanded, though the words felt hollow. Without Olivia, it wasn't much of a home to protect. As he swung into the saddle, Daniel caught sight of their homestead in the fading light. The small but sturdy house they'd built together, the barn, the corral, all of it meaningless without her. He'd been working so hard to build something for her that he'd forgotten to build it with her. Daniel turned Thunder toward the mountain trail and spurred him forward. The night was clear but moonless, making the path treacherous. He'd have to rely on Thunder's sure-footedness and his own knowledge of the terrain. "Let's bring her home, boy," he whispered to the horse as they plunged into the darkness. The mountain trail was barely more than a game path in some places, winding through dense pine forests and skirting steep drop-offs that would mean certain death if Thunder lost his footing. Daniel kept their pace as quick as safety would allow, painfully aware that each minute could mean the difference between catching Olivia or losing her forever. As he rode, memories of their life together played through his mind. Their meeting at a church social in Denver, where she'd been visiting relatives. The spark in her emerald eyes when she challenged his assertion that women couldn't appreciate the finer points of cattle breeding. Their hasty courtship, culminating in a proposal under an apple tree in full bloom. Her father's opposition to the match, Olivia being educated and city-bred, while Daniel was rough-hewn and land-hungry. They'd eloped, heading west with little more than dreams and determination. The first 2 years had been hard but joyful. They'd worked side by side, building their home, expanding their small herd, learning the rhythms of the land. Olivia had taken to ranch life with surprising adaptability, tending a vegetable garden that was the envy of Jackson, learning to shoot, ride, and even help with calving when necessary. The changes had come gradually. First, the miscarriage that had left them both grief-stricken. Then the drought that killed half their stock 2 summers ago. The bank loan that weighed on Daniel's shoulders like an anvil. And finally, the loss of the grazing rights that threatened everything they'd built. Daniel had withdrawn into himself, working harder, talking less. He thought he was protecting Olivia from his fears, his sense of failure. Instead, he'd pushed her away when they needed each other most. Thunder snorted and skidded slightly on loose shale, jerking Daniel back to the present. He steadied the horse and patted his neck reassuringly. "Easy, boy. We've got to keep going." The hours stretched on. Daniel's muscles ached from the constant vigilance required to navigate the treacherous trail. Twice, he dismounted to lead Thunder across particularly dangerous stretches. The cold mountain air cut through his coat, but he barely noticed, his mind fixed on a single purpose, reaching Olivia before morning. Dawn was breaking when Daniel finally emerged from the mountain pass. Below him sprawled the small settlement of Riverton, its buildings casting long shadows in the early light. He'd made good time, better than he'd dared hope. Now he just needed to find Olivia before the stagecoach departed. Riverton consisted of a single main street with a handful of buildings. A general store, a saloon, a small church, and the stagecoach station with its adjoining hotel. Daniel guided Thunder down the slope toward town, the horse's exhaustion evident in his labored breathing and lathered flanks. "Just a little further," Daniel murmured, patting the animal's neck. "You've done well, old friend." As they entered the town, Daniel scanned the street for signs of the stagecoach. Relief washed over him when he spotted it stationed outside the hotel, the team unhitched and presumably stabled for the night. He hadn't missed her. Daniel dismounted outside the hotel, his legs stiff and uncooperative after the long ride. He led Thunder to the water trough, allowing the exhausted horse to drink while he considered his next move. The sun was just clearing the eastern mountains, painting the town in golden light. The stagecoach wouldn't depart until 9 o'clock, according to the schedule he'd seen in Jackson. After ensuring Thunder was settled at the livery with instructions for his care, Daniel approached the hotel. It was a modest 2-story building with a covered porch and peeling white paint. His heart hammered against his ribs as he stepped through the door into the small lobby. A balding man with spectacles perched on his nose sat behind the reception desk, leafing through a ledger. He looked up as Daniel entered, his expression neutral. "Morning," the man said. "Looking for a room?" Daniel shook his head. "I'm looking for my wife." She would have arrived on yesterday's stagecoach from Jackson. Olivia Redfield. The clerk's eyes narrowed slightly. "Mrs. Redfield checked in yesterday evening. Room 4, upstairs." He hesitated, then added, "She seemed upset, said she wasn't to be disturbed." Daniel's jaw tightened. "Thank you," he said, already moving toward the stairs. "Mr. Redfield," the clerk called after him. "It's quite early. Perhaps you might wait until," but Daniel was already taking the stairs 2 at a time, his spurs jingling with each step. The upstairs hallway was narrow and dimly lit, with doors on either side. Room 4 was at the far end, its door like all the others plain wood with a brass number. Daniel stood before it, suddenly uncertain. What if she refused to see him? What if she'd already decided their marriage was beyond saving? He wiped his palms on his trousers and took a deep breath. Then, before his courage could fail him, he knocked. No response came. He knocked again, louder this time. "Who is it?" Olivia's voice, muffled by the door, sent a jolt through him. "It's me," Daniel said, his voice rough with emotion. "Olivia, please, can I come in?" Silence stretched between them, broken only by the sound of movement within the room. Then the door opened, revealing Olivia in her nightgown and robe, her dark hair loose around her shoulders. Her eyes were red-rimmed from crying, and the sight of her tear-stained face made Daniel's heart constrict. "Daniel!" She looked at him in disbelief, taking in his trail-worn appearance. "What are you doing here? How did you—" "I rode all night," he said simply. "Through the mountain pass." Her eyes widened. "That's dangerous in daylight, let alone at night. I had to reach you before the stage left." Daniel swallowed hard. "Can I come in, please?" After a moment's hesitation, Olivia stepped back, allowing him to enter the small room. It was sparsely furnished with a bed, a washstand, and a single chair. Her trunk sat unopened at the foot of the bed. She closed the door and turned to face him, her arms crossed protectively over her chest. "You look terrible," she said, her voice softer than he expected. Daniel gave a weary laugh. "I feel worse." He removed his hat, turning it nervously in his hands. "Olivia, the carefully prepared speech died on his lips. Instead, the raw truth spilled out. I've been a fool. I thought I was protecting you by shouldering our troubles alone, but all I did was push you away when we needed each other most." Olivia's expression remained guarded, but she didn't interrupt. "When you left yesterday," Daniel continued, "it was like the sun went out. Our home isn't a home without you in it. I don't want the ranch, the cattle, any of it if you're not there to share it with me." Tears welled in Olivia's eyes. "You stopped talking to me, Daniel. You stopped seeing me. I felt like a ghost in my own home." "I know," he said, his voice breaking. "And I'm so sorry. I was scared of failing you, failing us. But in trying not to fail, I lost sight of what matters most. He took a tentative step toward her. I love you, Olivia. I've loved you since that day in Denver when you put me in my place about cattle breeding, and I'll love you until my last breath. Please come home with me. Let me prove that I can be the husband you deserve. Olivia wiped a tear from her cheek. Words are easy, Daniel. How do I know things will be different? Daniel reached into his pocket and pulled out the sketch he'd found in her drawer. I found this, he said, holding it out to her. And it reminded me of who we were, who we can be again. I want to see you laugh like that again. I want to be the man who makes you laugh like that. Olivia took the drawing, her fingers trembling slightly. I kept this to remind me of what we once had, she said quietly. Of what I hoped we could have again. We can, Daniel insisted. I know we can. I'll sell part of the herd if I have to, or take on odd jobs in town. We'll face whatever comes together, not apart. Olivia studied his face, searching for sincerity. What she saw must have reassured her, because her expression softened. You really rode through the mountain pass at night, for me. Daniel nodded. I'd have swum across the ocean if that's what it took. A small smile tugged at the corner of her mouth. That would have taken considerably longer. Daniel laughed, relief beginning to loosen the knot in his chest. True, but I'd have done it all the same. Olivia set the drawing on the bed and took a step toward him. I didn't want to leave, she admitted. I just didn't know how to reach you anymore. I'm here now, Daniel said, his voice thick with emotion. And I'm listening. I want to hear everything, your fears, your dreams, your frustrations. No more shutting you out. Olivia closed the distance between them, hesitantly placing her hand on his chest. I want to believe that. Then believe this, Daniel said, covering her hand with his own. I love you more than life itself, Olivia Redfield. And if you come home with me, I swear I'll spend every day showing you just how much. For a long moment, Olivia searched his face. Then, with a small sob, she threw her arms around his neck. I love you too, you stubborn fool. Daniel held her tightly, burying his face in her hair, breathing in the familiar scent of lavender soap that he'd missed so desperately in just one night without her. Does that mean you'll come home? He murmured against her ear. Olivia pulled back enough to look into his eyes. Yes, she said firmly. But things have to change, Daniel. Real change, not just promises. They will, he vowed. Starting right now. Outside the window, the sun climbed higher, bathing the room in warm light. Daniel brushed a strand of hair from Olivia's face, marveling at how close he'd come to losing her. He leaned forward and kissed her softly, pouring 5 years of love and one night of desperate fear into the gentle pressure of his lips against hers. When they finally parted, Olivia's eyes remained closed for a moment, as if savoring the connection. When she opened them, Daniel saw what he'd been missing for too long, the spark of love, of hope, that had first drawn him to her. I need to get dressed, she said, a hint of her usual practicality returning. And you look like you could use some breakfast and a wash. Daniel grinned. Are you saying I smell bad, Mrs. Redfield? Like a man who rode through the mountains all night, she confirmed, but her eyes were twinkling. Fair enough, Daniel conceded. I'll wait for you downstairs. As he turned to leave, Olivia caught his hand. Daniel, she said softly, thank you for coming after me. He squeezed her hand. Always, he promised. No matter how far you go, I'll always come for you. An hour later, they sat across from each other in the small dining room of the hotel, the remains of breakfast between them. Daniel had washed up and looked marginally more presentable, though exhaustion still shadowed his eyes. Olivia had changed into a simple blue dress, her hair neatly braided and pinned. I've been thinking, Daniel said, pushing his empty plate aside. About what you said, about things needing to change. Olivia nodded, watching him expectantly. I want to start by being honest with you about where we stand, he continued. The ranch is in trouble. The bank loan is due in 3 months, and without the south pasture, our herd isn't thriving like it should. I knew things were difficult, Olivia said, but you never shared the details. Because I was ashamed, Daniel admitted. I promised you a good life when I brought you out west, and instead I've given you hardship. Olivia reached across the table to take his hand. I didn't marry you for an easy life, Daniel. I married you because I loved you. I still love you. I can handle hardship. What I can't handle is being shut out. Daniel turned her hand over, tracing her palm with his thumb. No more shutting you out, he promised. From now on, we face everything together. Together, she agreed. Now tell me everything. How bad is it really? Daniel took a deep breath. Without the south pasture, we can't maintain the size of our herd. We need to sell at least 20 head to make it through until next spring. And even then, we'd be cutting it close with the bank payment. Olivia considered this. What about my father's offer? Daniel's expression darkened. Olivia's father, a wealthy banker in Denver, had offered them a loan when they first started struggling. But Daniel had flatly refused, unwilling to be indebted to the man who had opposed their marriage from the beginning. I know you don't like the idea, Olivia continued before he could respond. But it might be our best option. He'd hold it over our heads forever, Daniel said, and he'd use it to try to convince you to come back to Denver. I'm not going back to Denver, Olivia said firmly. Not permanently, but maybe we should consider a compromise. Daniel raised an eyebrow. What kind of compromise? What if we invited him to visit? Let him see what we've built, show him that we're making a real life out here. If he sees how serious we are, how committed, maybe he'll offer better terms. Daniel was skeptical, but he'd promised to listen to her ideas. And if he doesn't, then we'll find another way, Olivia said with the quiet determination that had first attracted him to her. There are other options we haven't explored. The Cooper place has been vacant since old man Cooper died last winter. His son doesn't want it. We could lease that land for grazing. Daniel blinked in surprise. How do you know that? A small, sad smile curved Olivia's lips. Because while you were working yourself to exhaustion, I was talking to people in town, gathering information, trying to find solutions. Shame washed over Daniel. He'd been so wrapped up in his own struggles that he hadn't even noticed his wife actively trying to help. I'm sorry, he said, the words inadequate but sincere. Don't be sorry, Olivia replied. Just be my partner again. Daniel nodded, humbled by her forgiveness, her strength. I will, he promised. Starting with considering your father's offer and the Cooper place. The relief in Olivia's smile was worth the pride he'd have to swallow. Thank you, she said softly. They finished their meal in companionable silence, each lost in thought but no longer divided by the walls Daniel had built between them. As they prepared to leave, the hotel clerk approached their table. Mrs. Redfield, he said, the stagecoach is preparing to depart. Will you be continuing your journey today? Olivia exchanged a look with Daniel, a silent communication passing between them. No, she answered, turning back to the clerk. I'll be returning to Jackson with my husband. The word husband had never sounded sweeter to Daniel's ears. The clerk nodded and left them to settle their bill. Outside, the town had come to life, with people moving purposefully along the boardwalk and wagons rolling down the dusty main street. The stagecoach stood ready, passengers climbing aboard for the journey south. Daniel and Olivia watched it depart, standing side by side on the hotel porch. We should head back soon, Daniel said, glancing at the sky. It's a long ride, even taking the main road. Olivia nodded. But first, there's something I need to tell you. She took his hand, her expression serious but not somber. I wasn't just leaving because of how distant you've been. There was another reason. Daniel's heart skipped a beat. What is it? Olivia guided his hand to rest against her stomach. We're going to have a baby, Daniel. The world seemed to stop spinning for a moment as her words registered. A baby, he repeated, his voice barely more than a whisper. Olivia nodded, tears shining in her eyes. I found out for certain 2 weeks ago. I wanted to tell you, but you were so preoccupied, so worried about the ranch. And after what happened last time. Her voice faltered, the memory of their lost child still painful. Daniel pulled her into his arms, overwhelmed by a surge of emotions: joy, fear, wonder, and a fierce protectiveness that took his breath away. A baby, he murmured into her hair. Our baby. He felt her nod against his chest. I was afraid, she admitted. Afraid of losing this one too, afraid of facing it alone if you couldn't pull yourself out of your worries long enough to share it with me. Daniel held her tighter. You're not alone, he said fiercely. Not ever again. We're in this together, you, me, and our child. When he finally released her, Olivia's eyes were damp, but her smile was radiant. I hoped you'd say that. Daniel placed his hand on her stomach again, marveling at the miracle growing within. How far along? About 3 months, Olivia replied. The doctor in Jackson says everything looks healthy so far. Daniel did a quick calculation. So by winter, late November, he thinks. A vision of Christmas with their newborn child filled Daniel's mind. We have so much to prepare, he said, the enormity of what lay ahead beginning to sink in. We have time, Olivia assured him. And we have each other. Daniel looked into her eyes, seeing their future reflected, their challenges and joys, hardships and triumphs, all faced together. I love you, he said simply. I love you too, she replied. Now let's go home. The journey back to Jackson was considerably more pleasant than Daniel's desperate night ride. They took the main road, which added miles but was far safer for Olivia in her condition. They rode side by side, Daniel on Thunder and Olivia on a gentle mare borrowed from the Riverton livery stable, to be returned by the next freight wagon headed that way. As they rode, they talked more openly than they had in months. Daniel shared his fears about the ranch, about fatherhood, about failing the people he loved most. Olivia spoke of her loneliness during the past year, her worry for their future, and her unwavering belief in their ability to overcome whatever challenges lay ahead. They stopped frequently to rest, particularly when Olivia showed signs of fatigue. During one such break, sitting beneath a stand of aspens while the horses grazed nearby, Daniel broached a subject that had been troubling him. If things get really bad with the ranch, he said carefully, would you consider moving back to Denver, just temporarily, he added quickly when he saw her expression. Until we get back on our feet. Olivia considered this, her hand absently stroking her still flat stomach. Would you come with us? She asked, thus sending a thrill through Daniel's heart. Of course, he said without hesitation. I wouldn't leave you and the baby. Then yes, she decided. If it comes to that, I'd consider it, but only as a last resort and only temporarily. Daniel nodded, relieved. I hope it doesn't come to that, but it's good to know we have options. They continued their journey, the landscape growing more familiar as they neared home. The Tetons rose majestically in the distance, their snow-capped peaks gleaming in the afternoon sun. Daniel found himself seeing the beauty of their land through fresh eyes, appreciating what he'd nearly lost. I'm thinking of starting a vegetable garden, Olivia said as they rode. A big one, not just for us but to sell produce in town. Jackson's growing and fresh vegetables are always in demand. Daniel considered this. That's not a bad idea. We've got that patch of good soil near the creek that's not being used for anything. Exactly what I was thinking, Olivia said, pleased that he was receptive. And I could preserve some for winter, Maybe even start making jams to sell. You always did make the best blackberry preserves, Daniel said with a smile. Remember that first summer when we picked so many we stained our hands purple for a week? Olivia laughed, the sound like music to his ears. And you kept sneaking berries while I was trying to count them. They tasted better stolen, Daniel teased. Their easy banter continued as the miles passed beneath their horses' hooves. By the time they crested the final ridge overlooking their ranch, the sun was beginning to set, painting the valley in hues of gold and amber. Daniel reined in thunder, taking in the sight of their home from this vantage point. The house and barn looked small against the vastness of the landscape, but they represented everything he and Olivia had built together. It looks different somehow, Olivia murmured beside him. Daniel understood what she meant. It looks like home again, he said. They rode down the slope toward the ranch house. As they approached, Martha came bounding out to greet them, barking joyously. Daniel dismounted and helped Olivia down from her horse, his hands lingering at her waist. "Welcome home, Mrs. Redfield," he said softly. Olivia smiled up at him, her eyes reflecting the setting sun. "It's good to be home, Mr. Redfield." Martha circled them excitedly, clearly delighted by Olivia's return. Daniel led the horses to the corral while Olivia knelt to greet the dog properly, laughing as Martha licked her face. Inside, the house felt different than when Daniel had left it the previous night. With Olivia's return, it was once again filled with possibility. They moved around each other in the familiar space, lighting lamps, stoking the stove, preparing a simple meal from what was on hand. As they sat across from each other at the kitchen table, Daniel reached for Olivia's hand. "I know things won't be perfect right away," he said. "We've still got challenges ahead." "I don't expect perfect," Olivia replied. "I just want us to face those challenges together." Daniel nodded. "Together," he agreed. "And I was thinking tomorrow I'd like you to ride with me to check on the herd. Show you exactly what we're dealing with, get your thoughts on what to do next." Olivia's eyes widened slightly in surprise, then warmed with appreciation. "I'd like that." Later that night, lying in bed with Olivia curled against him, her breathing soft and even in sleep, Daniel stared at the ceiling, his mind still active despite his exhaustion. The past 36 hours had been transformative. He'd nearly lost everything that mattered, then been given a second chance he wasn't sure he deserved. He placed his hand gently on Olivia's stomach, trying to comprehend the miracle growing within. A child. His child. Their child. The responsibility was terrifying but also exhilarating. Daniel made a silent promise to the tiny life beneath his palm. He would be present, engaged, the father this child deserved. He would work alongside Olivia to build not just a ranch, but a home filled with love and laughter. And he would never again take for granted the extraordinary woman sleeping beside him, who had given him her heart and now carried their future within her. With that vow fresh in his mind, Daniel finally surrendered to sleep, his arms wrapped protectively around his wife and unborn child. The next morning dawned clear and cool, the kind of spring day that promised warmth by noon. Daniel woke before Olivia, slipping quietly from bed to begin his chores. He fed the livestock, collected eggs from the chicken coop, and had coffee brewing by the time Olivia emerged from the bedroom, her hair loose around her shoulders. "You should have woken me," she said, stifling a yawn. "I could have helped." Daniel crossed the room to kiss her good morning. "You needed the rest. How are you feeling?" "A little tired, but good." She placed her hand on her stomach. "No sickness this morning, thankfully." "That's good," Daniel said, pouring her a cup of coffee. "I thought we'd ride out after breakfast, check on the herd like I mentioned last night." Olivia nodded, accepting the coffee gratefully. I'd like that. They ate a simple breakfast of eggs and leftover biscuits, then saddled their horses for the ride to the north pasture. The day was warming rapidly, wildflowers dotting the meadows as they rode side by side. "I've been thinking about the Cooper property," Daniel said as they rode. "You're right that it would be a good solution for our grazing problem." "Old Mrs. Cooper is still living in town with her daughter," Olivia replied. "I'm sure she'd be happy to lease the land rather than let it sit idle." Daniel glanced at her, impressed by her knowledge. "You really have been paying attention to things around town." Olivia gave him a wry smile. "One of us had to." He accepted the gentle rebuke with a nod. "Fair enough. I thought maybe we could ride into Jackson tomorrow, talk to Mrs. Cooper about terms." "I'd like that," Olivia said. "And perhaps we could visit Dr. Parker while we're there, just to make sure everything's progressing well with the baby." "Of course," Daniel agreed immediately, making a mental note to prioritize Olivia's health in the coming months. They crested a rise, and the north pasture spread out before them. The cattle were scattered across the landscape, grazing on the spring grass. Daniel's experienced eye assessed their condition critically. "They are thinner than they should be," he noted. "The grass here isn't as rich as in the south pasture." Olivia surveyed the herd thoughtfully. "Which ones were you thinking of selling?" Daniel pointed out several groups of cattle as he explained his reasoning. "The older cows that aren't calving anymore, definitely. And maybe some of the younger steers that won't be ready for market until next year anyway." "What about those 10 over there?" Olivia asked, indicating a group grazing near a stand of cottonwoods. "They're looking particularly thin." Daniel nodded, impressed by her observation. "Good eye. They've been struggling since winter." They spent the next hour riding among the cattle, with Daniel explaining his concerns and Olivia asking questions and offering observations. By the time they turned back toward the ranch, they had formulated a plan. Sell 25 head now to reduce the pressure on their grazing land, approach Mrs. Cooper about leasing her property, and potentially sell another 15 head in the fall if necessary. "It won't be easy," Daniel admitted as they rode homeward. "We'll be setting ourselves back a couple of years in terms of building the herd. But we'll survive," Olivia pointed out, "and we'll rebuild together." Daniel reached across the space between their horses to squeeze her hand. "Together." That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of pink and gold, Daniel broached a subject he'd been considering all day. "I've been thinking about your father's offer," he said carefully. Olivia looked at him in surprise. "And if we're going to consider it, we should invite him out here like you suggested. Let him see what we're building." A slow smile spread across Olivia's face. "You're serious?" Daniel nodded. "I can swallow my pride if it means securing our future, our family's future." He placed his hand on her stomach, a gesture that was already becoming habitual. "I'll write to him tomorrow," Olivia said, covering his hand with hers. "He'll be surprised." "Probably suspicious too," Daniel added with a wry smile. "Most likely," Olivia agreed, "but he'll come. He's been looking for an excuse to check on me ever since we married." Daniel felt a twinge of the old resentment but pushed it aside. This wasn't about him or Harold Langford's disapproval. It was about securing their future. The next day they rode into Jackson as planned. The town was busy, with wagons lining the main street and people moving purposefully along the boardwalks. They tied their horses outside the general store and made their way to the small house, where Mrs. Cooper had been living since her husband's death. The elderly woman received them warmly, especially Olivia, whom she had always liked. When they explained their interest in leasing her land, she seemed genuinely pleased. "That property's been in the family for 30 years, she said, her rheumy eyes growing distant with memory. Breaks my heart to see it sitting empty. My William would want it worked, not left to go wild. We'd take good care of it, Daniel assured her. Just using it for grazing, not looking to build anything permanent. Well, now that sounds just fine, Mrs. Cooper decided. Let me talk to my son-in-law about the particulars. He handles the business matters now. But I don't see why we can't come to an arrangement. As they left Mrs. Cooper's, Daniel felt cautiously optimistic. That went well, he remarked as they walked down the boardwalk. She's always been reasonable, Olivia replied. And she knows how hard it is to make a go of it out here. Her husband nearly lost their place twice before they finally established themselves. Their next stop was Dr. Parker's office. The doctor was a jovial man in his 50s who had delivered most of Jackson's children over the past 20 years. He greeted Olivia warmly and seemed pleased to see Daniel accompanying her. Good to see a husband taking an interest, he commented as he examined Olivia. Too many men think pregnancy is solely a woman's concern. Not anymore, Daniel said firmly, standing beside Olivia and holding her hand throughout the examination. Dr. Parker pronounced both Olivia and the baby to be in excellent health. Everything is progressing just as it should, he assured them. But given what happened last time, I want to see you monthly until your 7th month, then every 2 weeks until the birth. We'll be here, Daniel promised, exchanging a look with Olivia that conveyed his commitment. Their last stop in town was the post office, where Olivia mailed her letter to her father. As they walked back toward their horses, Sheriff Tom Mallory hailed them from across the street. Daniel, Olivia, got a minute? They crossed to meet him, and Daniel noted the serious expression on the lawman's weathered face. What is it, Tom? He asked. Thought you should know Harrington's been making noise about that creek that runs between your properties. Daniel frowned. The creek in question was technically on his land, but it was the only water source for a portion of the south pasture that now belonged to Harrington. What kind of noise? Saying you might try to dam it up or divert it, the sheriff replied. Just talk so far, but thought you should be aware. Daniel's jaw tightened. Victor Harrington had been a thorn in his side since the man arrived in the territory 2 years ago, buying up land and throwing his weight around. It was Harrington who had manipulated the grazing rights away from Daniel through political connections and questionable legal maneuvers. I've got no intention of touching that creek, Daniel said stiffly. It's my land, but I'm not the kind of man who'd deprive cattle of water. Sheriff Mallory nodded. Figured as much, but wanted you to know what was being said. After the sheriff moved on, Olivia slipped her arm through Daniel's. Don't let him get under your skin, she said softly. Daniel took a deep breath, forcing himself to relax. You're right, he's not worth it. He patted her hand where it rested on his arm. Come on, let's head home. As they rode out of town, Daniel couldn't help glancing in the direction of the Harrington ranch. The man represented everything Daniel disliked: wealth without work, power without principle. But dwelling on that anger wouldn't solve their problems. You know, Olivia said, breaking into his thoughts, if we're going to have my father visit, we should consider fixing up the spare bedroom. It's been serving as storage since we built the addition. Daniel welcomed the change of subject. That's not a bad idea. When do you think he might come? Knowing father, as soon as possible once he gets my letter. Probably within a month. Daniel calculated mentally. That gives us time. We could repaint, maybe get that new bedstead from the mercantile you've had your eye on. Olivia looked pleased. You notice that? I notice more than you think, Daniel replied with a smile. I just haven't been very good at showing it lately. The days that followed settled into a new rhythm, one marked by partnership rather than parallel lives. True to his word, Daniel involved Olivia in every decision regarding the ranch. They rode out together each morning to check on the herd, worked side by side to prepare the vegetative garden Olivia had proposed, and spent their evenings planning for the future, both immediate and long-term. 2 weeks after they returned from Riverton, Daniel arranged the sale of 25 head of cattle to a buyer from Cheyenne. The price wasn't as good as he'd hoped, but it was fair, and the resulting reduction in their herd made the remaining cattle healthier on the limited grazing land. Mrs. Cooper's son-in-law had agreed to lease them the Cooper property at a reasonable rate, with the first payment due after the fall sale of cattle. This arrangement gave them breathing room and allowed Daniel to sleep easier at night, knowing their remaining herd would have adequate grazing. As April turned to May, the ranch flourished under their joint care. Olivia's garden took root, promising a bountiful harvest by late summer. Daniel repaired fences and outbuildings that had been neglected during his single-minded focus on saving the herd. Together, they cleared out the spare bedroom and prepared it for Harold Langford's visit, which was confirmed by a terse letter that arrived 3 weeks after Olivia had written to him. "He'll be here on the 15th, Olivia announced one evening as they sat on the porch, enjoying the mild spring evening. "That gives us just over a week to finish preparations." Daniel nodded, tamping down the nervousness he felt at the prospect of his father-in-law's visit. Harold Langford had made no secret of his belief that Daniel wasn't good enough for his daughter, that life in Wyoming territory was too hard, too dangerous for his city-bred child. Their few previous encounters had been strained at best, openly hostile at worst. "He'll stay for a week," Olivia continued, scanning the letter, "and he says he's looking forward to assessing our situation firsthand." She looked up at Daniel. "That's actually quite conciliatory coming from him." "I'll believe that when I see it," Daniel muttered, then caught himself. "Sorry. I promise to keep an open mind." Olivia smiled, reaching for his hand. "It won't be easy for either of you, but I appreciate your willingness to try." The day of Harold Langford's arrival dawned clear and warm, with a gentle breeze carrying the scent of wildflowers from the surrounding meadows. Daniel and Olivia rode into Jackson to meet the stagecoach, both dressed in their Sunday best despite the impracticality for the dusty ride. As the stagecoach rolled into town, Daniel felt Olivia tense beside him. He reached over to squeeze her hand reassuringly. "It'll be fine," he said, hoping he sounded more confident than he felt. Harold Langford emerged from the stagecoach looking remarkably unrumpled despite the long journey. He was a tall, distinguished man in his early 60s, with silver hair and the same green eyes as his daughter. He carried himself with the confidence of a man accustomed to command, his tailored suit a stark contrast to the practical attire of those around him. "Father," Olivia called, dismounting quickly and moving to embrace him. Langford's stern expression softened as he hugged his daughter. "Olivia, my dear, you look." He held her at arm's length, his gaze assessing. "Well, you look radiant." Daniel dismounted and approached, extending his hand. "Mr. Langford, welcome to Jackson." Langford regarded him coolly before accepting the handshake. "Daniel, thank you for the invitation. I must say, it came as quite a surprise." "We have a lot to talk about," Daniel replied evenly, "and we thought it was time you saw our home for yourself." Langford's eyebrows rose slightly at the "we," but he made no comment. Instead, he turned to address a matter with the stagecoach driver regarding his luggage. Olivia moved to Daniel's side, slipping her arm through his. "So far, so good," she murmured. Daniel wasn't so sure, but he kept his doubts to himself as they helped Langford secure his trunk to the back of the wagon they'd brought for this purpose. The ride to the ranch was filled with Olivia's cheerful commentary about the town's growth and the surrounding landscape, with occasional pointed questions from her father and brief, polite responses from Daniel. As they approached the ranch, Daniel found himself seeing it through Langford's eyes: the modest house, the weathered barn, the corrals and outbuildings that showed signs of hard use and hasty repair. It wasn't grand by Denver standards, but it was theirs, built with their own hands and determination. "Here we are," Olivia announced as they pulled into the yard. "Home." Langford surveyed the property, his expression unreadable. "It's rustic," he finally commented. Daniel bit back a retort, reminding himself why they had invited the man. This was about securing their future, not defending his pride. "We're still building," he said instead, helping Langford down from the wagon. "Each year we add something new, make improvements." "I see," Langford replied, though his tone suggested he didn't see at all. They showed him to the spare bedroom, freshly painted and furnished with the new bedstead they'd purchased in town. Olivia had added touches that reminded Daniel of the Langford home in Denver: embroidered pillows, a small landscape painting, a crystal water pitcher on the washstand. "This is quite comfortable," Langford admitted, looking genuinely surprised. "I expected something more primitive." "We're not complete savages out here, Father," Olivia said lightly, but Daniel caught the edge beneath her teasing tone. "I never suggested you were, my dear," Langford replied. "I merely questioned whether this life could provide the comforts and security you were raised to expect." "Perhaps you'd like to rest before dinner," Daniel suggested, sensing the conversation veering toward dangerous territory. "The journey must have been tiring." Langford agreed, and they left him to settle in. As they walked toward the kitchen, Olivia squeezed Daniel's arm gratefully. "Thank you for being diplomatic," she whispered. "I'm trying," he replied with a wry smile, "but it's only been 20 minutes. Dinner that evening was a carefully orchestrated affair." Olivia had prepared her father's favorite dishes, and Daniel had opened a bottle of good whiskey he'd been saving for a special occasion. The conversation remained carefully neutral, focused on news from Denver and events in the broader territory. It wasn't until after dinner, when they moved to the porch to enjoy the mild evening, that Langford broached the subject of their invitation. "Your letter mentioned financial difficulties," he said to Olivia, though his gaze was fixed on Daniel. "I'd like to understand exactly what you're facing." Daniel took a deep breath and laid out their situation honestly: the loss of the grazing rights, the bank loan coming due, the steps they'd already taken to address the problems. He spoke plainly, but without self-pity, stating facts rather than making excuses. Langford listened without interruption, occasionally nodding as he sipped his whiskey. When Daniel finished, the older man was silent for a long moment, considering. "You've taken sensible steps," he finally said, surprising Daniel with what almost sounded like approval. "Reducing the herd, securing additional grazing land, but you're still overextended with that bank loan." "Yes, sir," Daniel agreed. "We'll make the payment, but it will leave us with little reserve for emergencies." Langford studied him thoughtfully. "And what happens next winter when you need to buy feed? Or if there's another drought?" Daniel exchanged a glance with Olivia. "That's partly why we asked you to visit," he admitted. "We're considering your offer of assistance, but we wanted you to see what we're building first. To understand that this isn't a lost cause." Langford's eyebrows rose. "I'm impressed by your candor, Daniel. It can't be easy for a man like you to ask for help." "It isn't," Daniel acknowledged, "but my pride isn't worth risking our future." He reached for Olivia's hand. "Especially now." Langford caught the gesture, his gaze sharpening. "Is there something else I should know?" Olivia smiled, her free hand moving instinctively to her stomach. "Yes, Father. You're going to be a grandfather in November." The news seemed to strike Langford speechless. He stared at his daughter, then at Daniel, various emotions flickering across his normally composed features. "A child," he finally said, his voice softer than Daniel had ever heard it. "My grandchild." "Yes," Olivia confirmed. "Dr. Parker says everything looks promising." Langford seemed to struggle with himself for a moment before setting his glass down decisively. "Well, that changes matters considerably," he said. "I won't have my grandchild born into uncertainty." Daniel tensed, anticipating an ultimatum return to Denver or face the consequences. But Langford surprised him again. "I'm prepared to offer you a loan," the older man continued. $5,000, enough to clear your bank debt and provide operating capital for the next 2 years. Interest at 3%, well below market rate. Repayment to begin in 3 years, giving you time to rebuild your herd properly." Daniel blinked in surprise. The terms were more than fair, they were generous. "That's unexpected," he admitted. "I'm a businessman, Daniel," Langford replied. "I don't make offers out of pure sentiment. I've always believed this venture of yours was foolhardy, but I can see now that you've created something with potential. With proper capitalization, you might actually succeed." "Thank you, Father," Olivia said, her eyes shining. "That's incredibly generous." Langford held up a hand. "I have conditions, of course." Daniel had expected as much. "Such as? First, I want quarterly financial reports. Nothing elaborate, just a clear accounting of income, expenses, and herd size." Daniel nodded. That was reasonable. "Second, I want Olivia to return to Denver for the last month of her pregnancy and the first month after the birth." Olivia started to protest, but Langford continued. "Jackson is a growing town, but Denver has better medical facilities should complications arise. And your mother would never forgive me if she missed the birth of her first grandchild." Daniel looked at Olivia, seeing the conflict in her eyes. The request wasn't unreasonable, considering the risks of childbirth on the frontier. And it was temporary, not the permanent relocation they had feared Langford might demand. "We'll consider it," Daniel said carefully, "but the decision will ultimately be Olivia's." Langford seemed about to argue, but then nodded grudgingly. "Fair enough." He paused, then added, "There is one more condition." Daniel braced himself. "Yes. If you're going to raise my grandchild in this wilderness," Langford said, gesturing at the vast landscape surrounding them, "you're going to need a proper house. Something with enough bedrooms for a growing family, a proper kitchen for Olivia, and insulation that will keep a child warm through these Wyoming winters." Daniel and Olivia exchanged surprised looks. Of all the conditions they had anticipated, this wasn't one of them. "The house we have is," Daniel began, but Langford cut him off. "Adequate for a young couple starting out, not for a family." He leaned forward, his expression earnest. "I'm not suggesting a Denver mansion, Daniel, but something more substantial than what you have now. Part of the loan would be specifically designated for that purpose." Daniel was torn. On one hand, he'd always planned to build Olivia a better house once they were more established. On the other, accepting this condition felt like admitting he couldn't provide for his family on his own. Olivia seemed to sense his struggle. "We have been discussing a larger house," she said carefully, "especially with the baby coming." "Then it's settled," Langford declared, apparently taking their non-refusal as agreement. "I'll have my attorney draw up the papers before I leave." As they prepared for bed that night, Daniel remained unusually quiet. Olivia watched him as he methodically undressed and folded his clothes, knowing he was processing the evening's conversation. "His terms are more than fair," she finally said, sitting on the edge of their bed. "Better than we could have hoped for." "I know," Daniel replied, sitting beside her. "That's what bothers me. Why is he being so reasonable? Your father has never approved of me, of this life we've chosen." Olivia considered this. I think seeing the ranch in person made a difference. And the news about the baby. She placed her hand over the slight swell of her stomach. Father has his faults, but family means everything to him. Daniel covered her hand with his own. I want to build you that house myself, he admitted, with my own hands from my own earnings. And you will, Olivia assured him. This loan just gives us the breathing room to do it right instead of rushing or cutting corners. She turned to face him fully. Daniel, accepting help isn't failure. Sometimes it's the strongest thing a person can do. Daniel searched her eyes, finding only love and unwavering support. When did you get so wise, Mrs. Redfield? I've always been wise, Mr. Redfield, she replied with a smile. You're just finally listening. He laughed softly and kissed her, his earlier tension beginning to dissolve. Then I'll keep listening, and I'll accept your father's offer, conditions and all. Olivia's smile widened. Good, because I've already been designing our new house in my head for months. The week of Harold Langford's visit passed more smoothly than Daniel had dared hope. The older man made a genuine effort to understand the ranch operation, riding out with Daniel to inspect the herd and the newly leased Cooper property. He asked intelligent questions and occasionally offered suggestions that, to Daniel's surprise, were actually helpful. Most surprisingly, Langford seemed to develop a grudging respect for what his daughter and son-in-law had built. By the time the papers were signed and the arrangements finalized for the transfer of funds, the tension between the two men had eased considerably. On Langford's final evening with them, as they sat on the porch watching another spectacular Wyoming sunset, he made an admission that stunned Daniel. I was wrong about you, he said abruptly, breaking a comfortable silence. Daniel turned to him in surprise. Sir. Langford kept his eyes on the distant mountains. When you married Olivia, I thought you were taking her away from civilization to a life of hardship and isolation. I was certain she'd be miserable, that you'd fail, and she'd return to Denver broken in spirit. Daniel remained silent, unsure how to respond. But I see now that I underestimated both of you, Langford continued. You've created something meaningful here, and despite the challenges, my daughter is happier than I've ever seen her. He finally turned to meet Daniel's gaze. You're a good man, Daniel Redfield. I may not have chosen this life for my daughter, but I can see now that she chose well. The acknowledgement, so long withheld and so unexpected now, left Daniel momentarily speechless. Thank you, sir, he finally managed. That means a great deal. Langford nodded once as if the matter was settled and returned his attention to the sunset. Beside Daniel, Olivia squeezed his hand, her eyes shining with unshed tears of happiness. The next morning, they saw Langford off on the eastbound stagecoach, their farewells warmer than any previous parting had been. You'll write when it's time? Langford asked Olivia as the driver called for passengers. Of course, father, she promised, embracing him. And you'll visit again after the baby arrives. Wild horses couldn't keep me away, he assured her, then turned to Daniel and extended his hand. Take care of them, son. Daniel shook his hand firmly. With everything I have, he vowed. As the stagecoach pulled away, Daniel put his arm around Olivia's shoulders, drawing her close against his side. Well, he said with a hint of wonder in his voice, that wasn't at all what I expected. Olivia laughed softly. People can surprise you when given the chance. Daniel kissed the top of her head. That they can, he agreed. Now, shall we head home? We've got a new house to plan. The months that followed were busy but purposeful. With the financial pressure eased by Langford's loan, Daniel and Olivia could focus on the future rather than merely surviving the present. They hired a local builder to help with the construction of their new home, though Daniel insisted on doing much of the work himself. The design they settled on was practical but comfortable 4 bedrooms to allow for future children. A spacious kitchen with modern conveniences that made Olivia's eyes light up, a large front porch facing the mountains, and a stone fireplace that would keep them warm through the harsh Wyoming winters. As summer progressed, Olivia's pregnancy became more pronounced. Her garden flourished under her care, providing fresh vegetables for their table and excess to sell in town. Daniel split his time between supervising the construction of their new home and managing the ranch, which was thriving now that they had adequate grazing land. By August, the frame of the new house was complete, standing tall on a rise just 100 yards from their original cabin. Each evening, they would walk hand in hand to inspect the day's progress, imagining the life they would build within those walls. "The baby's room should face east," Olivia said one evening as they stood in what would become the nursery. "So the morning sun will wake them gently." Daniel placed his hand on her rounded belly, feeling the strong kicks of their child. "I think this little one might wake us, regardless of where the sun is," he teased. Olivia laughed, covering his hand with hers. "Probably, but it's a nice thought anyway." As they walked back to their cabin in the gathering dusk, Daniel found himself overwhelmed with gratitude. Just a few months ago, he had been on the verge of losing everything that mattered. Now, he was watching his dreams take shape before his eyes. "What are you thinking about?" Olivia asked, noticing his thoughtful expression. "How lucky I am," he replied honestly, "and how close I came to throwing it all away." Olivia stopped walking and turned to face him. "But you didn't," she said firmly. "When it mattered most, you chose us." Daniel drew her into his arms, careful of her growing belly. "The best choice I ever made," he murmured against her hair. "The best choice I'll ever make." September brought cooler temperatures and the completion of the roof on their new home. Inside, the rooms were taking shape, with walls erected and windows installed. The builder estimated they would be able to move in by mid-October, well before the baby's arrival in late November. It was also time to decide about Olivia's father's condition regarding her confinement in Denver. After several long discussions, they reached a compromise. Olivia would travel to Denver in early November, and Daniel would join her there as soon as he had settled affairs at the ranch for the winter. "I'll only be a few days behind you," he promised as they finalized their plans. "And your parents' house is certainly more comfortable than our cabin for these last weeks." Olivia nodded, though he could see the reluctance in her eyes. "I know it's the sensible choice," she admitted, "but I'll miss our home." "We'll be back before you know it," Daniel assured her. "With our child in our arms and a new house waiting for us." As October progressed, the new house neared completion. Furniture was delivered from Cheyenne, some new, some carefully selected pieces from Denver that Harold Langford had shipped as a gift. Daniel worked alongside the builders, ensuring every detail was perfect, while Olivia supervised the interior arrangements from a comfortable chair on the porch, her advanced pregnancy limiting her mobility. The fall cattle sale went better than expected, with prices higher than the previous year. Daniel was able to settle their accounts in town and set aside a reserve for winter expenses, with enough left over to begin rebuilding their herd in the spring. On a crisp day in late October, they spent their first night in the new house. Though a few finishing touches remained to be completed, it was habitable and, more importantly, warm and secure against the approaching winter. "What do you think?" Daniel asked as they stood in the center of their new living room, the stone fireplace casting a warm glow over the space. Olivia turned slowly, taking in the high ceilings, the polished wood floors, the large windows that framed the spectacular view. "It's perfect," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Absolutely perfect." Daniel wrapped his arms around her from behind, his hands cradling her rounded belly. "Not quite perfect yet," he said softly. "Not until we fill it with our family." As if in response, the baby kicked strongly against his palm. Olivia laughed, placing her hands over his. "I think someone agrees with you." They spent that night in their new bedroom, the mountain air crisp through the partially open window, the sounds of the ranch muted by distance. Daniel held Olivia close, savoring these last weeks before their child's arrival would forever change their lives. "I've been thinking about names," Olivia murmured sleepily against his chest. "MMM," Daniel responded, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on her back. "For a girl, I thought maybe Sarah, after your mother." Daniel felt a surge of emotion at the suggestion. His mother had died when he was 14, but her strength and kindness had shaped the man he became. "She would have liked that," he said softly. "And for a boy, perhaps William, after my grandfather," Olivia continued. "He was the one who encouraged me to follow my heart, even when father opposed our marriage." "Sarah or William," Daniel tested the names. "Both sound right to me." Olivia yawned, nestling closer. "We'll know which one fits when we meet them." The first week of November brought the time for Olivia's departure to Denver. Daniel had arranged for her to travel by private wagon to Cheyenne, where she would board a train for the remainder of the journey. Mrs. Peterson, the midwife from Jackson who had attended many births in the area, would accompany her all the way to Denver, ensuring she had proper care during the journey. The morning of her departure was clear but cold, with the first dusting of snow on the distant peaks. Daniel loaded Olivia's trunks into the waiting wagon, his movements efficient but reluctant. Despite knowing this separation was temporary and for the best, he felt a growing unease at the thought of being parted from her, especially in her condition. Olivia seemed to sense his concern. As they stood beside the wagon for their farewell, she took his hands in hers. "It's only for a few weeks," she reminded him gently. "And you'll be joining me in Denver before you know it." Daniel nodded, trying to smile for her sake. "I know, He struggled to articulate the fear that had been growing within him. "Last time you left, I almost lost you," understanding dawned in Olivia's eyes. "Oh, Daniel," she stepped closer, placing a hand on his cheek. "You're not losing me, we're not those same people anymore. You're not shutting me out and I'm not running away. This is a practical decision we made together, remember?" Daniel covered her hand with his own. "I remember, but promise me you'll be careful, that you'll take care of yourself and our little one." "I promise," she said solemnly. "And you promise me you'll finish what needs to be done here and join us as quickly as possible." "I promise," he vowed. 2 weeks at the most. I'll be there well before the baby arrives." Their farewell kiss was lingering and sweet, filled with promise rather than sorrow. As the wagon pulled away, Olivia waved from the window, her smile reassuring. Daniel stood watching until it disappeared from view, then turned resolutely back to the ranch house. He had much to accomplish before he could join his wife in Denver. The days following Olivia's departure were busy ones. Daniel worked from dawn until dusk, ensuring the ranch would be secure during his absence. He hired Tom Wilson, a reliable young man from town, to look after the livestock while they were gone, showing him the routines and introducing him to the peculiarities of each animal. 5 days after Olivia left, Daniel received a telegram from her father confirming her safe arrival in Denver. The message included a note from Olivia herself. "Arrived safely. Baby and I well, missing you terribly. Come soon. All my love, oh." Those simple words eased the knot of worry in Daniel's chest. He redoubled his efforts, determined to join her as quickly as possible. A week later, with the ranch secured for winter and arrangements made for Tom to check on their new house regularly, Daniel was ready to depart. He planned to leave the following morning, taking the same route Olivia had wagoned to Cheyenne, then train to Denver. That evening, as he packed his final belongings, a heavy snow began to fall. Daniel watched through the window with growing concern. Early November storms weren't uncommon, but this one seemed particularly intense, the wind driving the snow horizontally across the landscape. By morning, nearly a foot of snow blanketed the ranch, with drifts twice that depth against the buildings. The road to town was completely obscured. Daniel stood on the porch, surveying the transformed landscape with a sinking heart. Travel would be impossible until the storm passed and the roads were cleared. Throughout the day, the snow continued to fall. Daniel paced the house restlessly, checking the weather hourly, hoping for some sign of improvement. By evening, the storm had intensified rather than abated. Another foot of snow had accumulated, and the wind howled around the eaves of the house like a living thing. Daniel slept poorly that night, his dreams filled with images of Olivia calling for him, needing him, while he struggled through endless snow to reach her. He woke before dawn, immediately moving to the window. The sight that greeted him made his heart sink further. The storm had not only continued, but appeared to have worsened overnight. For 3 days, the blizzard raged unabated. Daniel managed to make his way to the barn to care for the animals that hadn't been moved to winter pasture, but venturing further was impossible. He sent no word to Olivia, as there was no way to get a message to town. On the 4th day, the storm finally began to ease. The snow stopped falling, though the wind continued to sculpt the massive drifts into fantastic shapes across the landscape. Daniel knew the roads would be impassable for days, perhaps a week or more. As he stood on the porch, staring at the transformed world and calculating how long it might take before travel became possible again, a terrible realization struck him. Olivia's due date was less than 2 weeks away. If he couldn't leave soon, he might miss the birth of their child. The thought was unbearable. He had promised to be there, had vowed not to leave her alone for this momentous event in their lives. Yet here he was, trapped by circumstances beyond his control, exactly as he'd been trapped by his own pride and fear months earlier. But this time was different. This time, Daniel refused to be defeated by circumstances. If the roads were impassable by wagon, he would find another way. Decision made, Daniel returned to the house and began preparations. He packed essential supplies, food, extra clothing, his heaviest coat and gloves. He cleaned and loaded his rifle, though he hoped it wouldn't be needed. Then he wrote a note for Tom Wilson, explaining his actions in case the young man arrived during his absence. By mid-morning, Daniel was ready. He saddled Thunder, his most dependable mount, who had proven his worth during that desperate night ride to Riverton. The gelding was strong and sure-footed, with a calm temperament that would serve them well in the challenging conditions ahead. "It's just you and me again, old friend," Daniel murmured as he secured the last of his supplies to the saddle. "We've got to bring our family home." With a final glance at the ranch house, their first home together, now standing empty in the snow, Daniel mounted Thunder and turned the horse's head toward Cheyenne. The main roads would be impassable, but he knew the terrain well enough to find alternative routes. It would be a difficult and dangerous journey, but Daniel was determined. As they moved away from the ranch, the snow reached halfway up Thunder's legs in places. The horse moved carefully, testing each step. Daniel kept their pace deliberately slow, knowing that a misstep could mean disaster for both of them. By noon, they had covered only a few miles. The going was even more difficult than Daniel had anticipated, with hidden drifts and deceptively deep snow in places where the wind had sculpted the landscape. But he pressed on, his mind fixed on a single goal: reaching Olivia before their child entered the world. As the afternoon wore on, the temperature began to drop. Daniel had expected this and was dressed for severe cold, but he worried about thunder. The horse was working hard to forge a path through the deep snow, and the exertion had him sweating despite the frigid air. "We'll find shelter soon," Daniel promised, patting the animal's neck. "Just a little further." He knew of an old line shack about 10 miles from the ranch, used by cowboys during the spring and fall roundups. If it was still standing, it would provide shelter for the night. Pushing on after dark in these conditions would be suicide. The light was fading when Daniel finally spotted the crude structure, half buried in snow but intact. Relief washed over him as he guided Thunder toward it. The small cabin was Spartan, but offered protection from the elements' 4 walls, a roof, and a small fireplace where he could build a fire to ward off the bitter cold of the Wyoming night. After ensuring Thunder was sheltered in the lean-to attached to the shack, with a portion of their precious grain supplies to supplement what little grazing he could manage, Daniel turned his attention to his own needs. He cleared the ancient fireplace of snow that had blown down the chimney and started a small fire with the dry wood stacked neatly against one wall left by the last occupants, for which he was profoundly grateful. As warmth slowly filled the tiny space, Daniel removed his outer layers and spread them near the fire to dry. He ate a simple meal of jerky and hardtack, washing it down with melted snow heated over the fire. Outside, the wind picked up again, howling around the eaves of the shack like a living thing. Daniel's thoughts turned to Olivia, warm and comfortable in her parents' Denver home. Was she thinking of him, worrying about his absence? He had promised to join her well before the baby's arrival, and here he was, still in Wyoming, separated from her by miles of snow-covered terrain. "I'm coming," he whispered into the darkness, as if she might somehow hear him across the distance. "I promised I'd be there, and I will." Sleep came fitfully that night, interrupted by the need to tend the fire and check on Thunder. When dawn finally broke, clear and blindingly bright, Daniel was already preparing for the day's journey. The temperature had dropped even further overnight, but the sky was clear, and there was no sign of more snow on the way. Small mercies for which he was deeply thankful. The second day's travel proved somewhat easier than the first. The snow had settled and compacted slightly, and in some places the wind had scoured the ground nearly bare. They made better time, covering almost 15 miles before darkness forced them to make camp in a sheltered grove of pines. Without the luxury of a cabin, Daniel created a makeshift shelter using pine boughs and his oilskin slicker. It wasn't comfortable, but it kept the worst of the wind at bay. Thunder stood nearby, occasionally stamping his feet against the cold but otherwise patient and steady, as he had always been. "We'll reach Cheyenne tomorrow if all goes well," Daniel told the horse as he offered him another measure of grain. "Then it's a warm stable for you and a train for me." The third day dawned clear and cold. Daniel estimated they were within 10 miles of Cheyenne, and with an early start, they might reach the town by mid-afternoon. He packed quickly and set out just as the sun was cresting the eastern horizon, turning the snow-covered landscape into a sea of diamonds. The terrain grew more familiar as they approached Cheyenne. Daniel began to recognize landmarks despite the transformation wrought by the snow. By early afternoon, he spotted smoke rising from chimneys in the distant Cheyenne, the territorial capital and the gateway to Denver. Relief surged through him as they crested the final ridge overlooking the town. Cheyenne was a substantial settlement, with a railroad depot that connected it to Denver and points east. If the trains were running, and they usually maintained service except in the most severe weather, he could be in Denver by the following day. The streets of Cheyenne were partially cleared, allowing for wagon traffic, though the going was still difficult. Daniel guided Thunder carefully toward the livery stable near the depot, his eyes scanning the bustling street for signs that the railroad was operating normally. To his dismay, the platform at the depot was crowded with stranded passengers, and a notice board announced service suspended due to track conditions. Daniel's heart sank. The blizzard must have affected a much larger area than he'd realized, dumping snow across the territory and into Colorado. He dismounted outside the livery and led Thunder inside, grateful for the warmth of the building after days in the biting cold. The livery owner, a burly man with a thick beard, looked up from his work as they entered. "Mighty brave or mighty foolish to be traveling in this weather," the man commented, eyeing Daniel's snow-encrusted clothing. "Necessary," Daniel replied simply. "My wife's in Denver about to have our first child. I need to get there as soon as possible." The man's expression softened. "Ah, well, that explains it." He gestured toward the depot. "But you won't be taking the train today or tomorrow either, from the looks of things. Tracks blocked between here and the Colorado line. They've got crews working on it, but with more snow predicted tonight." Daniel felt a wave of desperation. There must be some way to get through. The livery owner shook his head. "Not unless you can fly, friend. Even the mail stages aren't running." Daniel arranged for Thunder's care, paying extra for the best treatment the livery could provide. The horse had earned it, carrying him through some of the most challenging conditions imaginable. Then he made his way to the hotel across from the depot, hoping to learn more about the railroad situation and explore any possible alternatives. The lobby was crowded with stranded travelers, their faces showing varying degrees of resignation and frustration. Daniel approached the desk clerk, a harried-looking young man who was fielding complaints from multiple directions. When there was finally a lull, Daniel asked, "Any word on when the trains might be running again?" The clerk shook his head. "Railroad's saying at least 2 days, but between you and me, it'll be longer. The drifts are 15 feet deep in some places south of the border." Daniel's heart sank further. 2 more days at minimum and possibly longer. Olivia's due date was just a week away, and first babies were unpredictable. It could come early or late. "Is there any way to get a telegram to Denver?" he asked, thinking that at least he could let Olivia know he was trying to reach her. "Telegraph lines are down south of here," the clerk replied. "They're working on repairs, but with this cold." He shrugged eloquently. Daniel thanked him and secured the last available room in the hotel, a small attic space with a sloped ceiling and a narrow bed. It wasn't comfortable, but it was warm and dry, luxuries he'd lacked for the past 3 days. After a hot meal in the hotel dining room, his first proper food since leaving the ranch, Daniel returned to his room to consider his options. They were limited, to say the least. He could wait for the trains to resume service, which seemed to be the sensible choice given the conditions. But every instinct rebelled against inaction when Olivia needed him. Alternatively, he could try to find another means of transportation, a private sleigh or snow-capable wagon that might navigate the drifted roads. It would be expensive and risky, but possibly faster than waiting for the railroad. As he pondered his choices, exhaustion from the difficult journey caught up with him. Despite his worries, Daniel fell into a deep sleep, his body demanding rest after days of hard travel and cold. He awoke to the sound of voices in the hallway outside his room. Disoriented at first, Daniel quickly remembered where he was and why. He rose and dressed rapidly, then made his way downstairs to check on the status of the trains. The news wasn't good. Overnight, another 6 inches of snow had fallen south of Cheyenne, further complicating the clearance of the tracks. The earliest estimate for resumed service was now 3 days away. Daniel's frustration mounted as he stood in the crowded depot, staring at the notice board as if he could change its message through sheer force of will. He had promised Olivia he would be there for the birth of their child, and time was slipping away. As he turned to leave, a voice called out to him. "Redfield, Daniel Redfield from Jackson." Daniel looked up to see a familiar face, James Cooper, son of the late William Cooper and his wife, from whom they had leased grazing land. The young man was approaching with a smile of recognition. "Cooper," Daniel acknowledged, extending his hand. "What brings you to Cheyenne?" "Business for my mother," James replied, shaking Daniel's hand firmly. "Got stuck here by the storm, same as everyone else." He gestured at the crowded depot. "Trying to get back to Denver where I live now." "Denver?" Daniel's interest sharpened. "That's where I'm headed. My wife's there, about to have our baby." James's eyebrows rose. "Well now, that's a pressing matter indeed." He glanced at the notice board, then back at Daniel. "I might be able to help. I've got business connections with the railroad." "Let me see what I can find out about the real status of the tracks." Hope flickered in Daniel's chest. "I'd be much obliged." James disappeared into the station master's office, emerging 15 minutes later with a thoughtful expression. "It's not as bad as they're letting on," he reported in a low voice. "They've actually cleared most of the track already, but they're being cautious about resuming passenger service because of liability concerns." "What about freight?" Daniel asked, an idea forming. James grinned. "Now you're thinking like a businessman. There's a freight train scheduled to leave tonight, carrying urgent supplies to Denver. No passengers allowed officially." "But unofficially," Daniel pressed. "Unofficially, the conductor is an old friend of my father's," James replied. "For the right consideration, he might be persuaded to take on a passenger who's willing to ride in less than luxurious conditions." Relief and gratitude washed over Daniel. "I've ridden through a blizzard and slept in a lean-to for the past 3 nights," he said. "A freight car would be a palace in comparison," James laughed. "Good man. Let me talk to the conductor and make arrangements. Meet me back here at 8 tonight, ready to travel. And bring cash. This kind of favor doesn't come cheap." "I don't care what it costs," Daniel said firmly. "I just need to get to my wife." True to his word, James arranged passage for Daniel on the freight train departing Cheyenne that night. The consideration was steep $50, nearly a month's income from the ranch in better times, but Daniel paid it without hesitation. The accommodations were indeed less than luxurious. A corner of the caboose, shared with the conductor and brakeman, with no proper bed or seating. But it was warm, and it was moving toward Denver, which was all that mattered to Daniel. "You're a lucky man, Redfield," the conductor told him as the train pulled away from Cheyenne, its powerful engine building speed. "We're the first train to make the run since the storm hit. If your wife's baby has your timing, you might just make it." Daniel managed a smile at that. "Let's hope so," he said, "and thank you for this. I know you're taking a risk." The conductor waved away his thanks. "James Cooper's father was a good man, helped me out of a tight spot once. Consider this returning the favor through his son." The journey south was slow but steady. The train stopped frequently as the crew checked the tracks ahead for safety, but they continued to make progress through the snow-covered landscape. Daniel dozed fitfully in his corner of the caboose, waking at each stop, anxious about further delays. Dawn broke as they crossed into Colorado, the mountains to the west painted pink and gold by the rising sun. Daniel watched the familiar landscape roll past, calculating the remaining distance to Denver. If they maintained their current pace, they would arrive by mid-afternoon. His thoughts turned to Olivia, as they had countless times during this journey. Was she comfortable? Anxious about his absence? Had the baby already arrived? The possibilities tormented him as the miles slowly passed beneath the train's wheels. At last, shortly after 2 in the afternoon, the train began its approach to Denver. The city had grown significantly since Daniel had last seen it 5 years earlier, when he and Olivia had departed for Wyoming. Smoke rose from countless chimneys, and the streets were busy despite the snow that blanketed the region. The train pulled into the freight yard rather than the passenger depot, but Daniel didn't mind the inconvenience. He thanked the conductor profusely, gathered his meager belongings, and stepped out into the cold Denver afternoon. The Langford home was in a fashionable neighborhood on the city's west side, a considerable distance from the freight yard. Daniel hired a cab, paying another exorbitant fare without complaint. As they drove through the city streets, his anticipation and anxiety mounted in equal measure. What if he was too late? What if something had gone wrong in his absence? The possibilities haunted him, making the journey seem interminable despite the driver's steady pace. At last, the cab turned onto Mapleton Avenue, a tree-lined street of substantial homes set back from the road. The Langford residence was near the end, a 3-story brick mansion with white columns flanking the entrance. Daniel paid the driver and approached the house, his heart pounding. He had barely reached the porch when the front door flew open, revealing Harold Langford himself. "Redfield." The older man exclaimed, genuine relief in his voice. "Thank God you're here." Daniel's blood ran cold. "Olivia, the baby, both fine," Langford assured him quickly. "But the doctor says the baby's coming. Started early this morning." Relief made Daniel's knees weak. "I need to see her," he said, already moving past his father-in-law into the house. "Second floor, third door on the right," Langford directed. "The doctor's with her now and my wife. They've been expecting you. Olivia insisted you'd come, despite the storm." Daniel took the stairs 2 at a time, following Langford's directions to the bedroom where Olivia was in labor. He paused outside the door, suddenly uncertain. Should he knock? Enter quietly, wait to be invited? The decision was made for him when the door opened and Mrs. Langford emerged, looking tired but pleased. "Daniel," she said warmly, "you made it. Olivia will be so relieved." "Can I see her?" he asked anxiously. "Of course. She's been asking for you." Mrs. Langford stepped aside, allowing him to enter the room. The bedroom was spacious and well-appointed, with heavy drapes partially drawn against the afternoon light. A fire burned in the grate, keeping the room comfortably warm. And in the center of the large bed, propped up with pillows, was Olivia. She looked tired and strained, her hair damp with sweat, but to Daniel she had never been more beautiful. Her eyes widened as he entered, disbelief and joy washing across her features. "Daniel," she whispered, "is it really you?" He crossed the room in 3 strides, kneeling beside the bed and taking her hand. "It's me," he confirmed, his voice rough with emotion. "I promised I'd be here, didn't I?" Tears welled in Olivia's eyes. "The storm, I thought. It would take more than a blizzard to keep me from you," Daniel said firmly. "I rode through the snow to Cheyenne, then caught a freight train to Denver." A woman whom Daniel hadn't noticed, presumably the doctor, spoke from the other side of the bed. "As touching as this reunion is, Mrs. Redfield needs to concentrate now. The baby is coming quickly." Daniel started to rise, assuming he would be sent from the room as was customary, but Olivia's grip on his hand tightened. "Stay," she pleaded. "I need you here." He looked to the doctor, who nodded reluctantly. "You can stay if you promise not to faint or get in my way," she said briskly. "I'm Dr. Elizabeth Blackwell, by the way." Daniel nodded gratefully. "I promise." What followed were the most intense, terrifying, and ultimately miraculous hours of Daniel's life. He held Olivia's hand through each contraction, wiped her brow, whispered encouragement, and felt completely helpless in the face of her pain. Dr. Blackwell worked with calm efficiency, assisted by Mrs. Langford, who proved herself remarkably practical despite her society upbringing. As the afternoon faded into evening, Olivia's labor intensified. The contractions came closer together, each one seeming to drain more of her strength. Daniel's admiration for his wife grew with every passing hour. The courage and determination she displayed humbled him completely. "You're nearly there," Dr. Blackwell announced as Olivia gripped Daniel's hand with surprising strength. "The baby's head is crowning. With the next contraction, I want you to push with everything you have." Olivia nodded wearily, her face pale but resolute. When the next contraction began, she bore down with a determination that left Daniel in awe. He supported her, murmuring encouragement, his own heart racing as Dr. Blackwell guided their child into the world. And then, cutting through the tension in the room, came the most beautiful sound Daniel had ever heard, the indignant wail of their newborn child. "You have a daughter," Dr. Blackwell announced, a rare smile softening her professional demeanor. "A healthy baby girl." Daniel stared in wonder as the doctor placed the tiny, red-faced infant on Olivia's chest. Their daughter, Sarah. They had decided if it was a girl, had a dusting of dark hair and perfectly formed features that resembled Olivia's. "She's beautiful," Olivia whispered, tears streaming down her cheeks as she cradled their daughter. "Daniel, look what we made." "I see her," he replied, his own vision blurred by tears. "She's perfect, just like her mother." Dr. Blackwell and Mrs. Langford busied themselves with the practical aspects of the aftermath of birth, but Daniel barely noticed. His entire world had narrowed to the two people on the bed, his wife and his daughter, both miraculously safe and well despite all the challenges they had faced. Later, when Olivia and baby Sarah were cleaned up and resting comfortably, and the doctor had departed with instructions for their care, Daniel sat on the edge of the bed, holding his daughter while Olivia watched with tired satisfaction. "I was so afraid you wouldn't make it," she admitted. "When we heard about the blizzard, I promised I'd be here," Daniel reminded her gently. "Though I'll admit, there were moments I wasn't sure I could keep that promise. The snow was bad, Olivia, worse than anything I've seen since we moved to Wyoming. Yet you came anyway," she said softly. "Through a blizzard and on a freight train." "I would have walked if necessary," Daniel said simply. "I couldn't bear the thought of you facing this alone." Olivia smiled, reaching out to touch his cheek. "I knew you'd come. Everyone else was doubtful, but I knew." In his arms, Sarah stirred, her tiny face scrunching in what might have been a yawn or the prelude to a cry. Daniel marveled at her miniature features, the delicate eyelashes, the perfect fingernails no larger than grains of rice. "She looks like you," he told Olivia. "She has your nose." "And your chin," Olivia countered. "Stubborn already," Daniel laughed softly. "With the two of us as parents, she didn't stand a chance of being anything but stubborn." A knock at the door preceded Harold Langford's entrance. The older man approached the bed cautiously, his eyes fixed on the bundle in Daniel's arms. "May I?" he asked, his usual authoritative tone replaced by something close to reverence. Daniel carefully transferred Sarah to her grandfather's arms. Langford handled her with surprising ease for a man who had likely never changed a diaper in his life. "She's exquisite," he declared after a moment of silent study. Absolutely perfect. We think so, Olivia agreed with a tired smile. Langford looked from the baby to Daniel, his expression softening. You rode through a blizzard to be here, he said, not as a question but as a statement of fact. Daniel nodded. I had to. For a man who claimed ranching was in his blood, you seem to spend a remarkable amount of time riding through dangerous conditions to reach my daughter, Langford observed dryly. Daniel met his gaze steadily. She's worth it. They both are. Langford nodded, a rare smile transforming his usually stern countenance. Yes, he agreed. They certainly are. The weeks that followed were a blur of joy, exhaustion, and discovery as Daniel and Olivia adjusted to parenthood. Sarah proved to be a generally contented baby, though she had a formidable set of lungs when displeased. Daniel found himself utterly enchanted by his daughter, spending hours simply watching her sleep, marveling at the miracle of her existence. They remained in Denver through December, longer than initially planned due to the severe winter that had settled across the West. Regular telegrams from Tom Wilson assured them that the ranch was faring well under his care, and the new house remained secure despite the heavy snowfall. Harold Langford underwent a remarkable transformation in the presence of his granddaughter. The stern businessman melted into a doting grandfather who could often be found in the nursery, telling the infant improbable stories about her future triumphs. Christmas was celebrated with uncharacteristic simplicity in the Langford household, with Sarah as the undisputed center of attention. Daniel found himself surprisingly comfortable in his in-laws' home, the old tensions eased by the shared joy of their granddaughter's arrival. Have you thought about when you'll return to Wyoming? Langford asked one evening as they sat in his study, sharing a glass of fine brandy while the women put Sarah to bed. As soon as the weather permits safe travel, Daniel replied. Probably February, if the reports are accurate about this winter's severity. Langford nodded thoughtfully. It would be safer to wait until spring, he suggested. Travel with an infant in winter is risky. Daniel smiled, recognizing the not-so-subtle attempt to prolong their stay. Perhaps, he allowed, we'll see what conditions are like as February approaches. Langford studied him over the rim of his glass. You've changed, Redfield. Parenthood changes a man, Daniel replied simply. Not just that, Langford observed. You're steadier somehow. More confident in your decisions, less defensive about your choices. Daniel considered this. Nearly losing Olivia made me reconsider many things, he admitted, including my own stubbornness. Some battles aren't worth fighting, especially when they come at the cost of what matters most. A wise perspective, Langford said, raising his glass in a small salute. One I wish I'd acquired at your age. January brought a brief thaw, followed by another severe cold snap that settled across the Rocky Mountain region. Daniel monitored the weather reports closely, eager to return to their ranch, but unwilling to risk Olivia and Sarah's safety with hasty travel. By mid-February, conditions had improved enough to consider the journey. The railroad was operating regularly again, and reports from Wyoming indicated that while snow remained deep, the roads were passable. Are you certain you want to undertake this journey now? Mrs. Langford asked anxiously as they prepared for departure. Sarah is still so young and the weather so unpredictable. We'll be careful, Mother, Olivia assured her, and we miss our home. Daniel's been away from the ranch for months now. The journey back to Wyoming was considerably more comfortable than Daniel's desperate trip to Denver. They traveled in a private compartment on the train to Cheyenne, with every amenity the railroad could provide. From Cheyenne, they hired a well-appointed sleigh with a trusted driver recommended by James Cooper, who had continued to prove himself a valuable ally. The landscape was transformed by winter, the familiar terrain made strange by sweeping drifts and ice-laden trees. Yet as they approached Jackson, Daniel felt a profound sense of homecoming. This wild, challenging land had become part of him, part of them as a family. The ranch came into view as they crested the final ridge, their original cabin, the barn and outbuildings, and standing proudly on the rise, their new home, its windows gleaming in the February sun. "Welcome home," Daniel said softly to his wife and daughter as the sleigh made its way down the slope. Olivia smiled, her eyes bright with happiness. "It's good to be back," she said, squeezing his hand. Tom Wilson had prepared the house for their arrival, with fires burning in the fireplaces and the pantry stocked with provisions. He greeted them warmly, clearly proud of how he had maintained the property in their absence. "Everything's in good order, Mr. Redfield," he reported. "The cattle wintered well, thanks to the extra hay we put up in the fall, and the house stayed tight against the cold just like you built it to do." Daniel thanked him sincerely, impressed by the young man's diligence. "You've earned your wages and more," he said. "In fact, I'd like to discuss a more permanent arrangement if you're interested. We could use reliable help year-round, especially now." Tom's face lit up. "I'd like that very much, sir." That evening, as darkness fell across the snow-covered landscape, Daniel stood at the window of their new home, watching the stars appear one by one in the vast Wyoming sky. Behind him, Olivia moved quietly around the nursery, settling Sarah for the night. He thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment, not just the physical journey from Denver, but the longer, more challenging journey they had traveled as a couple. From their hasty courtship and elopement, through the hard early years of building the ranch, to the crisis that had nearly torn them apart, and now to this new chapter as parents. Olivia joined him at the window, slipping her arm around his waist. "She's asleep," she reported. "What are you thinking about? You look so serious." Daniel smiled, pulling her closer. "I was thinking about how far we've come," he said honestly, "and how grateful I am for second chances." Olivia rested her head against his shoulder. "We've both learned a lot," she said softly. "About what matters, about how to be partners in truth, not just in name." "I never want to lose sight of that again," Daniel vowed. "No matter what challenges come our way. We'll face them together," Olivia said simply. "The three of us now." From the nursery came the soft sounds of their daughter stirring. They turned as one, moving toward the room where the newest Redfield slept. As they stood over Sarah's cradle, watching the gentle rise and fall of her chest, Daniel felt a profound sense of contentment. This was what he had ridden through a blizzard for, what he would do again without hesitation. Not just duty or obligation, but love in its purest form for the woman who had chosen to build a life with him, and for the daughter who represented their shared future. Outside, snow began to fall again, soft flakes drifting past the window. But inside their home, all was warmth and light and the quiet joy of a family complete. "I love you," Daniel said, the words simple but carrying the weight of all they had endured together. "And I love you," Olivia replied, her eyes reflecting the same depth of feeling. "Always." In that moment, with his wife beside him and his daughter sleeping peacefully, Daniel knew he had found the true meaning of home. Not the land, not the ranch, not even the house they had built, but the love that bound them together, stronger for having been tested, more precious for having almost been lost. That love would sustain them through whatever lay ahead, the harsh Wyoming winters, the challenges of raising a child on the frontier, the uncertainties of ranching life. Because they had learned the most important lesson of all, that together they could weather any storm.